virtually today for our second AIA New Orleans webinar, Contracts, Construction, and COVID-19. This is the second in a series of webinars that we have started in response to some of the issues that have come up in the AEC community around the spread of this pandemic. Today's topics are contracts, construction, and how city, state, and national orders might impact your practice. So just a note up front about the format for this webinar. Everyone is going to be on mute. So we won't be able to hear you, but you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A box, and we will collect those and share them with Keith, who will answer them at the end of the presentation. We'll be making a recording of this available afterward. It will exist purely as a resource for you to look back on. Unfortunately, to get a learning unit for this, you'll need to attend the webinar as it happens live. And so, you know, we are a two-person team, and we can't really run IT issues while we're trying to make sure that the webinar happens smoothly. So if you do run into problems, please just call one of the numbers, one of the dial-in numbers for the Zoom webinar, and hopefully that will get you back on board with us. If you call in and you want credit for attending this webinar, make sure that you send your name and information to Lauren at aianeworleans.org for credit. On the agenda today, we will be hearing from our speaker, Keith Bergeron from Deutsch Kerrigan. After that, we'll have a Q&A session with your typed comments and concerns. And we'll close out by highlighting some of our upcoming webinars and other resources that we've put together for you. Our speaker, Keith Bergeron, earned his undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from the University of New Orleans in 1991. After graduation, he worked for Chevron Pipeline Company, designing capital improvements and major maintenance programs to support the company's assets located onshore Louisiana and in the Gulf of Mexico. While working, he attended night school at Loyola University of Law and graduated in 1998. In 1999, he joined Deutsch Kerrigan LLP, where his practice is dedicated to defending architects, engineers, and land surveyors against claims of professional negligence, licensing, and other contractual claims. So we'll hand things over to Keith, and a reminder that if you have any questions during his presentation, just please include them in the Q&A.
I think I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right, I'm sorry.
No
let
worries.
me back up and start over. Thanks for having me present today. I appreciate the invitation, as always, to serve the architects and engineers and other professionals in our construction community here in New Orleans and the state of Louisiana. My wife loves to print things for her class, so if you hear a printer in the background, that's what it is. Remember, I might be a lawyer that's focused on your issues, but I am not your lawyer, and the things that I'm telling you today are general information that you should use to assist you with risk management decisions that you might face moving forward. I am not giving you specific legal advice. If you have a specific question, I would suggest a couple of things. One, consult with your insurance brokers that place insurance for you. They are a huge resource, especially in times like today. Your carrier directly. Some of your carriers might have pre-assist claims procedures where they can hire a lawyer like me to specifically answer your questions. I do it all the time for XL AXA and a lot of the other professional liability insurance writers in Louisiana. And most of the time, my cost to do that is borne by the carrier and not passed along as a deductible. Sometimes there's a small fee, but sometimes there's not. So keep that in mind, that we're having a conversation. So let me flip with you to the next slide. So let's start off by me telling you how I developed this program and what we're going to kind of talk about so that everybody knows the topics moving forward. So I developed it using some really awesome resources that the AIA has on their website. In particular, the group is the AIA's risk management group, has prepared a lot of publications and guidelines and other things to consider as we all experience this pandemic together and how it's affecting our particular practices. So if you Google AIA risk management, you're going to find a lot of great resources. In fact, I'm going to be flipping between the PowerPoint on my screen and those things to hopefully answer a bunch of your questions. And then they also do some YouTube videos as well. And I would suggest that if you don't already subscribe to the AIA's channel, you do, because a lot of the stuff might seem familiar to you if you watched it. So we're going to talk about two main ideas. You probably have seen and been bombarded with ads about the word force majeure and how that affects construction contracts. I promise you that's the last time I'm going to say that word. We're not going to talk about that. You can go to the AGC or the ABC or any other contractor-based group and get that information. What we're going to talk about is what affects you as an architect. So we're going to talk about how it affects your firm's practice first. So a lot of the stuff that we go through in the beginning might be a little bit of a refresher because you probably already done it, I hope. And then second, we're going to examine the standard contract language in the B101, the owner-architect's agreement, that will assist you in your projects that are moving forward or maybe need to be suspended for whatever reason. So we'll spend some time doing both things. We'll also spend some time at the end discussing some ways to handle your services that are required for site visits and those types of issues, because we've had some questions about that. And so I've put together some information for you about some options you may have. So let's flip to the next slide and we'll get into our practice considerations. So first off, on this slide, you'll notice that there's a lot of information, and that's the biggest challenge that we all have been faced with, is that all of these organizations are bombarding us with information and resources about how they want us to behave in this pandemic situation that's new to all of us. And so there's a lot of resources there that are available for free. It provides a lot of valuable information and to you about how to protect yourselves, your family, and your fellow coworkers during this pandemic. The one that I go to every day is the governor's office has a web page with all of his executive orders. In fact, one was issued yesterday, which, if you haven't learned, it extends the stay-at-home mandate until April the 30th of this year. It also has a very good document. It's 3 pages. It's called The Illustrative Examples of Critical Infrastructure Businesses Consistent with the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency Guidance. That's a mouthful. But what that is, it delineates what is an essential business and what is not. And probably, I think it's the 3rd bullet down, is construction. And so construction in the governor's order is an illustrative service that it considers to be essential. There's a lot of people that are clamoring, why are we still building things, or why are we still having construction sites active? Primarily, I think if we shut everything down, it would be much like Katrina, where you needed a long time to jumpstart that industry again, and it just can't be, it can't happen overnight. And then, quite frankly, how would they build out the convention center for emergency medical services that they're doing now if construction was not essential? So there are a lot of essential things that our industry provides to the general public. The mayor's office in the city of New Orleans also has a very good FAQ document that it published at nolaready.gov about the construction industry and what the city would expect of its construction sites moving forward. It's a very good document. We also had a question before we started today about effects of the Stafford Act and whether or not that might change any of our design functions from a procurement or building code or any other design type issues. I did a little bit of research. I cannot say that I am the most proficient at the act. What I can tell you is that I have been unable to locate anything which would change or modify or eliminate or suspend the necessity of us designing things to a code, whatever the code might be for that particular thing and in that particular geographic location. What the Stafford Act does do is that President Trump declared 2 different types of emergencies. One was under the National Emergencies Act, which allows him to waive certain regulatory requirements. And the other one was a disaster relief program under the Stafford Act. And that is pretty much the one that the states use and request emergencies be declared so that they can receive and track reimbursements for emergency procurement that they do. So for instance, the best example would be all of the money that is being spent to convert the convention center into a temporary medical facility to handle COVID patients who are no longer need critical care, but aren't able to be released into the general population yet. So all of that money, the state is going to seek reimbursement through the Stafford Act and look at it as a 75-25% split. So the federal government, if it qualifies, which I'm sure it will pay 75% and the state will pay 25% of that. So that's what the Stafford Act pretty much does when it triggers under an emergency declaration. So that's about all I'm going to really cover there, because we could pretty much go on and on and on that particular act. So one of the things that I also did is this particular slide, you'll notice, has a lot of local or state type resources that you should go to. What if you have projects that are outside of the state of Louisiana? And I'm sure a lot of you do. So get your pens out. I'm going to give you kind of an appendix to the slide that relates to the construction industry nationwide. First off is my firm, and most law firms that have a construction practice usually have on their landing page of their website, click here for more COVID type information. Well, naturally our firm does, and we have a bunch of construction-based articles on that, so you can go there. But we pretty much have a presence just in Mississippi and Louisiana. So that's about where you'll get a lot of that information. I have a very good friend who practices in Texas at a firm in Dallas, and she is actually tracking every executive order, whether it be from a state or a county in the country that affects construction. It is a massive undertaking, and her and her partners are doing a yeoman's job. So if you are looking to see what's happening in North Carolina on the Outer Banks and you don't know if you can do something, I would suggest you go to the website. The firm's name is Winstead. So it's WINSTEAD.com. WINSTEAD.com. There's a COVID link you can click, and there's tons and tons of information on it. I went there this morning to see see if she had the latest Louisiana order, so I could chastise her if she didn't, but it was there. So I didn't get a chance to give her any grief about not keeping it up to date. So let's flip over to the next slide, please. So now you have all of this information amassed. What do you do with it? I mean, it's a lot of things to track. So what the AIA and other professional groups have suggested to its membership is that firms try to appoint a person or a group of people to try to keep track of all the changes and all the issuances of government actions, and then transmit that information, or read it, digest it, figure out if it affects you, and then transmit that information to your various employees and maybe sub-consultants and clients and things like that, just to so you can be looked upon as being someone who is up to speed and up to date on everything that's affecting everyone. If everybody tries to do that, then no one really does the work of an architect. Everybody's tracking government issuances. So it's much better to have one person dedicated to that task, or, depending on the size of your firm, a group of people. The other thing that I've seen firms do is they track it by their project. So if you have projects that aren't just in Louisiana, you have an actual page or notes from that particular design team that tracks those specific issues that would affect their project. And if you have the luxury of having multiple offices around the country, then each office should track their own state's issuances that might affect their working abilities. A lot of the firms that I've noticed and people have told me is that they actually have kind of a background page that their employees can log into while they work remotely, where all of this information is housed, and they have, naturally internal communications that they can do with their staff and partners where it's not necessarily for the public to see. So that's what we would suggest you do if you're not already doing that, just so you can stay up to date with all this constantly changing information. And let's go to the next slide. So now that you understand that what your business limitations might be that have been imposed upon you by the government, you should now try to understand what's happening in all of the projects in your portfolio and review what stages of completion they are. Definitely, you should have some updated contact list with all of your clients' information, all of your contractors' information if those jobs are out in the field. And specifically, because a lot of offices are working remotely and there's no one really answering a phone there, make sure that you have key people's cell phones. I know that I can always get in touch with some people by their cell phone. And sometimes I don't get a response to the emails. And then when I ask them, hey, I sent you an email 2 days ago, they tell me, well, I haven't been able to log in. My server's been having an issue with the pandemic. Things that used to be quick means of communication might not be as much. And as we all know, since we're all social creatures, sometimes the best way to address things is to simply pick up the phone and talk about it. So I would suggest that you have those lists and that you share those lists in your office so that everybody knows how to contact everyone, because things can change pretty quickly. And then finally, the big thing that you really want to make sure about is try to identify, if you haven't already, those projects that you believe will continue, and then those projects that may not continue for whatever reason or be suspended or have already been suspended. So let's talk a little bit about those types of things next in the next slide. So you've done your homework, you've gone through your portfolio, you've figured out that here are the 2 or 3 or 10,000 projects that are going to move forward and have the ability to move forward. So how do you continue those business activities? Well, take a step back. The one thing that you need to understand, just as if you were a contractor, is you need to understand who is available, who are your resources, who is still available to work, how can they work, where can they work, and those types of things. Then it's not just your employees and your staff members, but it's your clients. Some of them might not be able to continue to work. You need to understand that. The contractors, some may or may not be able to continue to work. You need to know those types of things. And very importantly, your consultants. Reach out to your engineering team members and your surveyors and your geotechs and all of the other interior designers and anybody else that you have as a consultant, and check to see with them and see what their capabilities are and what their capabilities aren't. And be honest with each other. If you've lost somebody or somebody's contacted the virus and is self-quarantined or is in the hospital and you're a man or lady down, people need to know that, so that your expectations, you don't set expectations too high and then get in trouble at the end. We'll talk about some troubles later in the slides. I also think that you should reach out to your bankers and your CPA. We've got a almost 800-page CARES Act, which probably affects a lot of you continuing and doing business, and you definitely need to know what you can do and get advice. And then the other thing is go over and review your work policies that you have in place for your employees. Maybe you have a working remote policy. Maybe you have some information technology and computer usage policies that are triggered because you're working remotely. Now people are using what I'll call non-provided business computers to log in and do work. Are those things secured? How are they going to make sure that the information that they have on them are secured? You do have a duty of confidentiality to your client. You don't want those types of things getting out there necessarily. So make sure that you look at your company's policies on those types of things and try to address those if you haven't already. And here's one that hit me the other day. I had taken a deposition before we left, and most of the court reporters send those transcripts to us by UPS. And I got an email from the UPS guy saying, hey, I'm trying to deliver something to your office and it's closed. So we had to make arrangements on how to handle just mail and overnight deliveries from FedEx and UPS and anybody else. So we now have a policy on that. I would suggest that if you don't, you at least consider it and put something in place to take care of those types of things, because just like lawyers, you probably receive a lot of packages and information from contractors, submittals, and those types of things might come to you overnight as opposed to electronically, depending on the size. You might want to put in place those project website type services. I know that is a trend, and it's probably going to be what everybody does moving forward, because it's a good way to communicate if you can get online and get on to them. All right, let's flip to the next slide. So one of the big things, if you have a project that's going to continue, is you need to understand how we are going to work within the Center of Disease Control's guidelines on essential services maintaining their work. Naturally, we have to ensure worker safety by being 6 feet apart and those types of things. We need to make sure once we understand those limitations, we might want to let our clients know. The biggest thing that I think will be an issue is when we don't share communications with our clients and our contractors and our consultants and our employees all the time. We should be in the mode of constant communication right now, because there's so much anxiety and trying to figure out what we're going to do. Humans solve problems much better collaboratively, and when we kind of shelter ourselves away from each other is usually when one person assumes that somebody else is doing something, and that might not be what's actually happening. So the more communications you can have, even if they're just phone calls or text messages or emails, is the better. Other thing that you should definitely do is gather all of your contracts that you might have for the various projects, whether they're studies that you're performing or actual contracts to actually design and do contract administration during construction. Make sure you have all of those. Make sure you look at all of that, those contracts, to determine if there are any specific dates to turn over deliverables. I know that there are a lot of public entities that write in specific dates to turn over deliverables. I know the Parish of Jefferson has a lot of those types of language before construction, that they want, their design documents done by a certain day, and sometimes the contract has that type of language. You need to look at that to see if you can comply. You might have lost your drafting person, your CAD operator that's responsible for that project because of self-isolation. Can you meet that deadline? You need to make that fact known that you might not have the ability to do it, and seek some relief with your client. I assure you that they should be even more reasonable now than before we were in this pandemic situation, because they're probably going through the same thing. And if you are open and honest in your communications about what you can and can't do, I think that will help you in the long term as you move forward through this crisis. You might have to ask the owner to suspend the project, and we're going to talk a little bit later on about suspension as we move forward, in case those types of things and scenarios come up. The biggest thing is if you and your client agree to any changes that your original contract required of you, is to make sure you get those agreements down in writing. I'm not suggesting that you have to have a formal change order or an amendment process, but if nothing else, you definitely have to write the history, which is, hey, Joe, today we talked about the design of XYZ project. I shared with you that my staff is severely limited because of the pandemic. I don't believe that we're going to be able to make this deadline, but we've agreed to an additional month. And we talked about it on the phone today, and thank you so much for your consideration, and we will do everything to meet that new deadline. That's an email. Now that's what you guys agreed to. That is now what I'll call an amendment to the contract. Whether or not it's signed, now naturally the other side could say, well, that's not what we agreed to. At least gives them the ability to confirm what you guys talked about. So anything that happens telephonically, make sure that you, as soon as it's finished, when you hang up the phone, send a little note back to the person, especially if you've agreed to do something that's different than the contract that you originally signed before all of this occurred. So let's talk a little bit about little more kind of things to keep in mind as we're moving forward with projects that are still going on. So let's go to the next slide. So you have that master list, and I'm sure that we all know that there are going to be issues that come up. So if we can identify potential claim issues, we should start doing that now. And when I say claim issues, you might get information from a contractor that says that they want to change the way that they had submitted to do something because they just can't do it. You need to make sure that they follow up with those things in writing, because that could be a cost impact to the client, and you've got to get them to start tracking that information. It might be issues where they were working very well, but all of a sudden the manpower has slacked. They can't get any deliveries. You need to make sure that they're tracking that type of information. So you can do that kind of stuff. And then you might have to restaff. So if you have people who are working on projects that become suspended, but then you have projects at the office that are now becoming accelerated because they impact a healthcare facility or something like that, you've got to move people around and let people know that you're moving people around. Some projects I've learned are starting to accelerate. I have some friends who practice up in the Northeast, and there's a bunch of conversions of places into critical care, and getting more beds available to allow the medical community to take in more patients and keep them. So you might have situations where you have an acceleration. And then the biggie on this particular slide is what to do about non-compliant job sites. So naturally, we're probably going to all experience this at some point. I saw a stat the other day that all construction sites are probably the most unclean places on the planet, as they are constantly changing and people in and out and stuff all over the place for the most part. That has to change naturally with these guidelines. I'm waiting, unfortunately, don't want it to happen, but I know it's probably inevitable that at some point the news is going to pick up on a story where a job site gets shut down because of it does not meet the CDC's guidelines, and or work hazards are prevalent and OSHA shuts them down. So it could happen. It's probably going to happen. What do you do if you notice those types of things? To me, I think you need to document that, and then have a frank discussion with the contractor. And if you can't get any compliance, or you disagree on what needs to be done, I think you need to involve the owner. And if you don't get any relief there, you might need to ask for a suspension of your services until those things are compliant, because you do have a duty to yourself and your staff to not put them in harm's way. And so we're going to have some troubling times moving forward, but I think if we all communicate frankly and constantly with each other, we'll figure out good alternatives on how to handle those types of situations. But I'm sure they will, and I'll probably be taking calls on those, and maybe questions on those as we get through this. So let's flip to the next slide. All right, so what to do about the projects that don't continue that we identify? Well, my big thing is to make sure, if they're not going to continue and they're under construction, that we have a discussion with the contractor about how they're going to secure that site, because we're getting ready to get into hurricane season. And if the building is not dried in, they could have issues. Even if it is dried in, we might have issues. So there needs to be some discussion about how to make that building secure, both from the physical elements, but also from vandalism and things like that. Maybe we'll have we suggest that the contractor has a security type person or guard or some service like that can patrol the perimeter to make sure that it doesn't get broken into. But we also need to make sure that those the client's property that's in place and is paid for is secured in such a way if construction is not going to be an ongoing process. Also need to make sure that we understand what notice provisions the owner and the contractor must give each other if they're not going to continue working. Naturally, no one wants to use the T word, which is termination. Most owners believe that this is a temporary thing, and I think all of us are very positively believing the same. So the alternative, I think, is better to suspend projects and not to necessarily terminate them unless there's other reasons that are going on. But you need to know what the construction contract provides, because you as the architect might be the initial decision maker who has to make the call as to should we terminate, should we suspend, do we have grounds to do so, how do we do that if that's the decision we made, what things do we need to make sure that are done before everybody walks away. And you might even want to put in a plan when everybody comes back, what do we do? Sometimes there might be insurances that are part of the owner's contract with the contractor that inures to the benefit of the owner in these situations, and you might want to Make sure you know what the insurance exhibit says and what they provided. The owner might have bought business interruption insurance, may not have. You don't know until you look. So I would look and see. You'll be a trusted advisor if you remind the owner that he has a policy that could be triggered because of suspension. I'm sure they'll always keep coming back for you because you've helped them out. If you got questions about those types of things, like I always say, your broker is a great person to have on your side, and your carrier might be able to help as well. So that's what we would do with those projects that don't continue. Let's go to the next slide. So the other thing that you got to keep in mind is this is a great time to market. You got to be ready for quick restart of those suspended projects. Like I said, make sure you have some type of plan. So when we get back, do you have the resources to move from whatever project they're on now back to the suspended project? Have some kind of plan on what you're going to do. Another thing that I got some questions recently from a client was there is a lot of RFQs that have been issued, and how do I visit a potential project site in order to prepare my RFQ? I need to see what it looks like. Now I may have to go take some measurements. There's no as-built information available. What do? I told them that visiting a potential project is just like visiting a project that's under construction. You need to talk to the person who has custody of that property. Here it would be the client, hopefully. Make arrangements to, if you can, send somebody out to visit it, see what limitations they have upon you going there, so that everybody knows what can and can't be done. It might end up that you FaceTime or Google Duo or some other means of a virtual walkthrough where they record the conversation, much like we're doing today, and show you things or point out things so that you can look at that video later on in helping you prepare your proposal. We are in different times right now, and leveraging the technology that we have available to us, I think is a good idea to try. And if you need more information, actually pick up the phone and call them. I don't think you should stop looking for work just because we have a pandemic. And then look at your portfolio and see what are those things that you have to do, but you just haven't started yet. Make sure that the clients want you to continue looking at those things. And then, you know, it's a good time to talk with other people and see what they're doing. Talk to clients and figure out what might be coming down the pipe. You'd be shocked and amazed how when you reach out to somebody right now where everybody's sitting at their house with their own family and can't communicate with anybody else, or at least feels like they can't, when you pick up the phone and talk to them, how much information you'll get out of them. I was on the phone yesterday with an adjuster, and we talked about everything. It was a great conversation, probably the greatest conversation I've had with him in a long time. Let's flip to the next slide. So we're going to switch a little bit now. We're going to talk about actual contract language in our B101 contract. I know that there are multiple versions and variants of the owner-architect agreement. Most of the clauses that we'll talk about here or in those other agreements, they just might be numbered differently. So really, the numbers aren't important. It's the concepts that we're going to talk about with the specific language. So let's flip to the next. So here's the biggie. This is the language which lays out the standard of care, in which all architects and design professionals are judged when someone claims that we didn't do what we should have. And that standard of care language is pretty much throughout all of the AIA documents. A very similar version of this language is in the consensus docs, and I know the little more detail of it is in the EJCDC documents that the civil engineers and engineering groups put out. So let's talk about some of the things that I've kind of put in red letters. Under the same or similar circumstances. Well, the pandemic has never happened before. So what's the standard of care under the same or similar conditions? We got no same, we got no similar. This is all new to me. And so I'm getting a lot of questions about what's the standard of care now and how am I going to meet that? So I usually have a discussion in this way. So think about it like this. The standard of care judges you against what other architects that do the same thing in the same location would do. So as long as you're doing what everyone else is doing, you're not going to get in trouble. So I always say, what are all the other firms doing to address these types of issues? Or what would a reasonable firm do when faced with the issue that you're presenting me with? Unfortunately, none of us today know the answer to that question. And none of us today will know the answer to that question until 5 years from now, some court, someplace is going to have to make that decision on whether or not an architect or an engineer met the standard of care by doing whatever he did during this pandemic. We don't know what that answer is going to be yet. So I can't give you the golden rule. However, what you need to understand is, and what you should try to always do, is openly communicate with all your project participants about the situation. Identify the situation, and then identify all the potential challenges that situation presents, and then work toward a mutually acceptable resolution so that you can comply with any of the executive orders that might be in place that govern that site. And whatever resolution you come up with, make sure, again, you document it and share it with everybody. And anybody who is expected to go to the site that you might ask to go there, so that everybody knows what the rules are. And I think if you do that, if you help your clients walk through the process of looking at and evaluating information critically, then I don't think anybody is going to fault you moving forward, because you're involving everyone, you're asking good questions, you're having a valid conversation about an issue, whatever that issue might be. So let's flip to the next one. So I remember I mentioned earlier in our talk that there could be situations where your contract requires you to perform by a certain date, but you might be inhibited from doing so because of the unique situations that affect your staff or the job site or something else. So Article 3.1.3 is the section of the contract that talks about the schedule for performance for architectural services. And you'll notice that I've highlighted in red for you an exception. So here's the scenario. You have a contract, it requires you to turn over deliverable by a certain day. You know you can't meet that because of the pandemic situation. So here's what the clause says. Once approved by the owner, that's what's happening, the time limits established by the schedule shall not, except for reasonable cause, be exceeded by the owner or the architect. Well, if we don't have reasonable cause now, I'm not sure what would be. So what you have to do is you have to document the reasonable cause, and you have to share that with your client, the owner, and you have to make sure that he understands what delivery impacts to the schedule you'll have because of the pandemic. This allows you to change or modify that prior agreement. So if you have some workforce shortage, limitations because you're working from home, you have limited access to equipment, your consultants aren't available to go out when you needed them to, or any other type of personnel type issue, now's the time to speak up so that you can establish what that reasonable cause is and have a frank communication with your client about that. You have the ability, the contract allows you to do it, so don't miss out. Let's jump to the next slide. We had a lot of questions about this particular topic on this slide. This is how we evaluate work that's progressing at the site. So it's 3.6.2.1, and it requires that the architect shall visit the site at intervals appropriate to the stage of construction and become generally familiar with the progress of the work and determine if it's being performed in compliance and in accordance with the contract documents. Well, what if you can't get to the site? How do you handle those types of things? How do you handle being on the site and having social distancing? What if you need not only you, the architect, but you need the structural engineer to go out to the site because steel is being erected? What if the structural engineer tells you he needs 4 people to come out with him because there's a lot of stuff to look at? What if you have a situation where certain personnel can't leave the house? They have kids that they have to take care of and they can't get away. They have elderly parents that they're taking care of, or they're self-isolating because they've got the virus or has been in contact with somebody. I know a lot of people are suggesting the use of video conferencing with a person who is at the site and who can go to the site, and everyone watches and decides how they're going to circumnavigate the site and what things they're going to look at and how long they're going to stay in that location and look at things. There are a lot of great tools that people have. I know that there are a lot of people that are looking at sites with drone technology because they can't add another 20 people to the site without getting in all of the way. You can't crowd around and look at the steel being erected because you got to be 6 foot away from each other. So there are all sorts of challenges, but there's all sorts of ways and creativity that we as humans can come up with to figure out a workaround. Those things need to be talked about before you go to the job site. You should not be figuring those things out while you're there. You should have that discussion beforehand. You should figure out what people have the ability to do. You'd be amazed at how tech savvy a lot of contractors are. They might even suggest it. I know I have a lot of people who doubt, like, what if they don't show me something, or what if they don't show me all of the stuff? At the end of the day, you should have some kind of protocols put in place that everyone can agree with. We're going to look at certain things. I want to walk through with you while we're both looking at the latest version of our application for payment to see what's been done since the last time you've submitted something. There is no bigger motivator to a contractor to know that their design professional on that particular project is working with them to identify how they can get paid. I promise you that if you can't get to the site, they will figure out a way to allow you to virtually get to that site. So anything you guys discuss, like I always say, get that in writing so that everybody can look at it, make sure that they're comfortable with it, and vet it. And then whatever that process or procedure is, share that with everybody so that everybody knows what they're going to do, including send it to your consultant who's got to get out there and look at something so he knows what the expectations are for him when he gets there. Are there different PPE that the contractor is going to require? Does he have to go to gate 1? Does he have to have his temperature scanned before he gets on? All of those types of things. Everybody needs to know what is expected of them when they get there. So share the information. Let's flip to the next one. So here's the solutions. I know I kind of covered 2 slides in one, but one of the things that I wanted to do on this particular slide is what happens if you've agreed to it and when you go out there, something different presents itself to you. I would say the best thing to do is when you get out there and there's something that's not as everyone agreed to, suspend the visit. Immediately contact the home office of the contractor. If they're not physically there with you, the project manager, about whatever the concern might be before you proceed. Talk amongst the firm, talk amongst the consultants who are there to make sure that everybody agrees that this is not the way that we all discussed. If you can't make progress in dealing with the contractor, then you have to bring it to the owner's attention. And if nothing is done that satisfies you that the people that you're sending to the site are protected and safe, I think the ultimate thing would be to cancel the visit and then document exactly what happened that led to the cancellation and share that in your email history so that it's written down and it's documented. Remember, the contractor and the owner cannot do anything illegal, and that is including doing things on the job site that would violate the governor's order or the city's order. The big trap that I'm worried about more than anything right now, given the climate that we find ourselves, is remember, means and methods and job site safety issues is solely within the control of the contractor. We as design professionals should never cross the line and overstep your bounds. Do not give safety instructions to the workers, okay? Even if you see something dangerous, immediately call the superintendent. Find the person in charge, the supervisor, and tell them, advise them of the condition that you saw. I promise you, when people see that you are taking safety into your own hands of workers that aren't your people, that's when, and then something bad happens to someone, that's when OSHA will become involved and they'll find out that you did that, and those instructions could subject you to penalties and all sorts of other things that we don't need to get into. Means, methods, and job site safety is the contractor's ambit. Naturally, we should tell them if we see something that's unsafe, but that's all we can do, okay? Let's go to the next slide. This is the most important one for us. So let's make sure that we talk about where in your contract you have the ability to receive compensation for extra work. And it's usually in Section 4, which is our additional services. But make sure that if there's something that you have to do to comply with the mandates of the executive orders that the government has given us, you tell the owner, you give him the ability to know about it, especially if you believe it's going to affect your bottom line and you're going to request additional services and compensation for those. I can promise you right now, the 4.2.1.1, there is a material change in the project. If you have to do more work in order to close a project down because work's been suspended, that's an additional service. You're going to have to track those plans. You're going to have to make sure that that contractor complies with shutting the job site down in an orderly and safe fashion and making sure that the property is protected. Those aren't things that you normally do as a design professional. Those are additional services that are only caused to happen because of a material change that's affected the project. So don't be shy, but definitely don't do it and then ask for forgiveness later. Tell the owner before you do it so that they understand what needs to be done, so that you can kind of have some type of budget for that additional service. I promise you again, your client will love you and be endeared to you and trust you if you do that for them. Let's flip to the next one. So this next clause is suspension. It's in section 9 and 9.2. The first is that if the owner suspends the project, the architect needs to be compensated for those services, much like we saw before, that are performed before the suspension occurs. So he needs to get current. That's what that means. 9.3 means if this pandemic happens and projects are suspended for more than 90 days cumulatively, you as the architect may terminate the agreement, but you have to give the owner 7 days written notice. So here's one of the options that the owner has. I would expect that most owners will suspend if there are conditions that are presented to them that they can't get around or they can't solve right now. So let's flip to the next one. Next slide. Here's the other option that the owner can take, is that he can terminate your agreement for convenience. If he chooses to terminate the contract, your design contract for convenience, there are certain things that he might have to pay you for that are attributable to the termination. So if you bought some equipment that you thought you were going to use, but now you can't, you can pass along those costs. Naturally, he has to get current, but there might be some cost in actually stopping and no longer working on this particular project. So you need to let them know what those things might be before they make that decision, because it might impact their decision. Let's flip to the next one. I had asked you and repeatedly reminded you to get your contracts amended. Here are the list of the various forms that the AIA has created and provided to you, their members, to use to clarify and capture the amendments that everyone's agreed to. So we're all usually familiar with the G701, which is a change order for general contractors. But remember, there's other Gs. 802 and 803 would be an amendment with the architect and the owner contract. 803 is the amendment with the architect and its consultants. And if you help negotiate or help prepare for the contractor change orders with his subs, there's a form 701S, which is the subcontractor agreement modification. Remember to get all those changes in writing. So let's flip to the next, which I believe might be the last. Yes. So remember, as I said throughout this entire presentation, communication is the key. We can't communicate enough at this point in time. We don't know how long it's going to last, and we don't know, no one can predict what's going to happen along the way. So the best thing that we can all do is communicate effectively together and efficiently and come up with equitable solutions and try as best we can to stay sane and stay safe by doing the best that we can for our clients as we move forward. So with that, I think I see there are a couple of questions. Let me look at those. I see one from Samantha Johnson. She says, where do we find the standard or guideline issued for construction site compliance? The only one that I am aware of is one that is typed up by the city of New Orleans. It's on nolaready.gov. It has specific requirements that the city wants to see at its construction sites. The Center of Disease Control has some general guidelines, which I think everyone is kind of putting into place, which is the 6-foot rule and no more than 10 gathered in one place, and those types of things. I don't believe that there is one overarching standard or guideline. There are many guidelines that are being issued by various governmental entities that may or may not be applicable for that particular construction site. But here in New Orleans, I believe the easiest one to refer to, and it's pretty comprehensive, is the one that's on the city's website on nola.ready.gov, I believe is what it is. So the next question that I see is, what are some examples of a job site that is non-compliant vis-a-vis the current pandemic? I currently know of no specific examples of non-compliance, but speaking generally, it would be those where a contractor has done nothing to implement wash stations, cleaning commonly touched areas, staggering breaks, trying to keep people from working on top of each other. Those are the types of things that would not be in compliance. So if you see those types of things happening, that would be an example. But I know of no current construction site that's being investigated. And I hope I never do. The next one is, please advise architects against accepting bids from contractors via email. Email does not satisfy the requirements for a secure, confidential transmittal of bids. So I know that the governor has suspended some things within the Public Works Act. He has definitely suspended things about advertisements and certain other items. I don't know how those are going to work. Each particular agency of the state is handling them in a certain way. Naturally, the local water districts probably don't even realize that that's happened. So they might be doing things differently. I know that they have suspended openings or public openings of bids, and they're doing them either virtually or on a phone call. No one gets to go and watch bids being opened anymore. Once the bids are submitted, that's how it's happening. I would suggest that we as architects, unless this is a private situation and you have a private client, not a public entity doing the construction, and that we never receive the bids at all, okay? That is completely and solely the manner for the public entity to receive those communications. They are the ones that have to receive them and open them. And then once they're open, they can share them with us for further evaluation. But I don't think we should ever be in the position to volunteer to receive them. That should always go through the public entity itself. There are too many problems that could or may happen if they don't come to us. It's much easier for the public entity to say, I didn't timely receive your bid, Mr. Contractor. And quite frankly, most of the public entities should be receiving bids electronically through the Public Works Act system of receiving electronic bids. that's the methodology that they should be receiving things electronically. I know there are some places that do not need to comply with that electronic submission of bids requirement because they're not big enough, the parishes are small, those types of things. But quite frankly, for the places where we would work, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, bigger cities, municipalities, they should already have the ability for people to submit bids electronically, whether they use a vendor or whether they have it in-house. That's up to them. Takeaway is we shouldn't be doing that for them. And then Jonathan said the city issued City of New Orleans COVID construction guidance FAQ. Yes, that is true. That's what that document is that I was referring to with the NOLA-ready.gov on it, is that particular document itself. So thank you, Jonathan, for giving me the correct name for it. All right. I really appreciate having the conversation today with all of you. I wish all of you well moving forward. Stay safe. And I will hopefully see everyone on the other side of this when it's done.
Yeah, thank you so much, Keith, for joining us and for sharing your expertise. We'll actually have another member of the Deutsch Kerrigan team on next week, giving a webinar on labor issues. That'll be on Thursday, April 9th. So you can register for that through our website. We also have a couple other learning activities coming up, including a couple continuing education units from our professional affiliate members. So on Tuesday the 7th, we have Kerrigan presenting about reading and understanding geotechnical reports. And Wednesday, April 15th, we have ventilated porcelain facades. So please be sure to check out our website and register for those, and we can all kind of keep up our continuing education credits. Please also, if you haven't already, be sure to check out our LinkedIn members forum. We have some other resources posted there, and we'll also be making this this webinar available through our website once we have processed it. It has been recorded. So please, everyone, be in touch and stay healthy. Thank you again, Keith, for providing this for our members, and we will all be in touch soon, remotely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.